Good morning to everyone. Welcome to the Warehousing and Fulfillment Online Conference by the Logistics Point. We will be starting very shortly with Libby Pritchard from Backhouse Jones Solicitors, who is taking us on a road trip around clean air zones, something which is becoming more and more popular, not just in the UK, but all around the world. I will bring Libby very shortly. But another announcement I would like to make is invite all of you today to our in-person event on the 21st of March, Tuesday in London. You will be able to hear from some of our speakers in the in-person event today. They are part of a few fireside chats later on. But with this very short introduction, I'm bringing on to the stream Libby, as I mentioned, from Backhouse Jones. Libby, thank you very much for joining us. And I will also bring your slides here.
Thank you.
And the stage is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks very much, Nick. And thank you for having me here today. Good morning, everybody. As Nick introduced, I'm Libby Pritchard. I'm Associate Director at Backhouse Jones Solicitors. We are a transport specialist firm. So we only deal with cases in the transport industry, and something that we have been tracking and looking at quite a lot is the clean air zones. We've been involved various stages in terms of clean air zones, from looking at the legality of clean air zones in various areas and right through to advising on the funding options that are available now to operators that are affected by clean air zones. And that's something really that I'm here to discuss and go through with you today. So if I can please just go over to my next slide. Thank you very much. So firstly, I think it's important to just go through where we've actually got the clean air zones at the moment. And if you just look at the list there are 7 areas at the moment where we have live clean air zones. The first being Bath, which was back in 2021. And then most recently, we've had Sheffield go live on the 27th of February 2023. In the pipeline at the moment, we've got Greater Manchester. Some people attending here today may well know about Manchester. It's under review at the moment and has been for about a year now. Predominantly, the reason for that is due to the size of the clean air zone. It's apparently meant to, or was going to be, the biggest in Europe, and also due to the vehicle funding and issues with getting new vehicles in time to comply with it. So that's going live at the moment. Now, I think it's fair to say that we can describe the clean air zones as a domino effect. We've had a number out here. We've got 7. We've got Manchester going live. I'm not aware of any consultations on any other areas at the moment, but I'm sure that they're going to follow. The reason for the clean air zones is due to an activist group quite a long time ago now taking the government to court on judicial review about the environment. So this is coming straight from the government, and it's something that has to be done. But obviously, you know, we need to make sure as much as we can that it's commercially viable for operators, because ultimately it's costing money. You need to make sure that it's commercially viable. So if we just go over to my next slide, please. So the cost, obviously this is the $1 million question, isn't it? What is it going to cost? Well, the penalties vary from area to area, but it's from £50 to £100. A lot of the areas have that process in place where if you pay within a certain amount of time, that it's reduced. So I suppose as a business, and I'm sure anybody that's attending today that is affected by the clean air zones has done, what you need to do is have a think about how you're going to deal with that cost. The options appear to be either, is it a cost you can pass on to your customer? So that pays for it and makes it cost neutral. Is it, can you reroute? Do you need to be going through the areas, and what effect will that have on additional fuel costs or wages costs? Or will you look to upgrade your fleet? The majority of them, if the fleet is Euro 6, then it means that you're not charged. What I would say about looking at passing the cost on to the customer is, whilst obviously we don't know because this is so relatively new, And I'm not a regulatory lawyer. I work in our dispute resolution team. But when I have discussed this with our regulatory team, something that has been suggested is how well it would go down with the traffic commissioner if you were consistently and continuously for a long period of time getting these fines, because ultimately the reason for the clean air zone is to help the environment. So if you were looking at passing this cost on, and that's the way you would deal with it, I would just keep in mind that that's potentially not a long-term resolution to it, because there might be implications there with the traffic commissioner. We don't know, but obviously we do have a team that are up in front of the TCs all the time, and that's something that we have thought about. So really the main option I'm therefore here to have a go through with you today is the funding that's available, and also just discuss with you the funding that's available and how you apply for that, and also the sort of right to appeal you've got if that's refused. So if we could just go over to my next slide. So going through this right to challenge. So firstly, I'll go through with you the funding and how that looks. So at the moment, then we've got the funding live in a number of the areas, and I have jotted it down here. So Birmingham, Portsmouth, Greater Manchester, even though it's under review, Newcastle and Sheffield are all areas that are still open for funding, where you can effectively apply for that funding. In terms of the funding and how much it is, again, it varies from the areas, and if you go onto the relevant website, you will be able to have a look and see. If I was to give you an example, because we've collated the information, for example, in Birmingham, the funding is available and it's up to £15,000 per vehicle, either to make changes retrospectively, or purchase or lease a new vehicle. So it's quite a lot of money that's available there. And again, that's just using Birmingham as an example. You would have to log on to the different sites to look at the funding available. In terms of the applications, again, it varies from area to area, so you would have to have a look. But if I go for you for Bradford, for example, the eligibility, some of the criteria, you have to have non-compliant vehicles that are used in the Bradford Clean Air Zone for at least some of the time. You have to have less than 250 employees, or your turnover has to fall below 45 million. We have been getting a lot of feedback from the various trade associations that we deal with that are dealing with this, and the feedback is that the application isn't straightforward at all. The evidence that's asked for how often that you go in the clean air zones can be quite difficult, and operators are having this refused what appears to be for no good reason. So, for example, one operator was told that some of the evidence they provided to show that they go through the clean air zone wasn't applicable because they didn't deliver the load in the clean air zone, despite the fact that they'd driven through it to pick it up. So it isn't proving to be straightforward, and the evidence and information that's asked for from the different areas is quite difficult. So this leads me on to the next point, which is the right to challenge. So do you have a right to challenge or a right to appeal if it's refused? Yes, you do. We don't know how that looks at the moment and how it's being dealt with. Again, do know from speaking to the trade associations that this is proving quite difficult. And what we would always say with this, having dealt with the local authorities, is that it is better to get the application right in the first instance than look to have to make the appeal, because you're sort of almost on the back foot when you're making an appeal, in terms of you've already been told no. So the overarching message here really is that there is funding there available. It varies from area to area. It's quite a substantial amount, and it's certainly worth applying for if you are going to be looking to upgrade in your fleet because you're affected by the clean air zone area. But it's not straightforward, so it is something that you need to take care and take time with. Now, we do offer a no obligation conversation about this, and with a business if they were looking to apply for the funding. And we do also offer a service where we can assist with making the application as well, if that was something that you were looking to do. So I think the overarching message here today is, if you are in these areas and you are affected, please do have a look at the funding that's available, because it may just be that you're eligible, and it may be that you're looking to take the plunge now and make that upgrade to the fleet. So if I can just go over to my next slide. That's just going through some details of training that's been put in there, if anybody was interested in that. And then I think if I just go over to my next slide, that was just to confirm my details. And I just really wanted to ask if anybody's got any questions at all.
And sorry, let me just add myself as well.
It's okay.
Wait, if some people would like to have a question, they can just write down this in the as a comment. But a few things you mentioned, that currently it seems like all of these legislations and new rules, I'm sure that we all know they are important, why they are important, but it seems like it's a city by city basis, and they might be different in one city to another. And is there a way that legally companies can try and influence what is happening, not just in one city, but overall in the whole country?
Yeah, I mean, if at the moment, so there's not really a lot you can do now that they're here. And I think in theory, you know, it is a good idea for us to have the clean air zones. We just need to make sure that they're done in a way that's commercial for businesses, because it's pointless being there if it's not then viable for businesses to continue. If the clean air zone has already been implemented, then, and there's something, or the way it's being run, that you think could be done better, then I think it is important to make that point to the local authority. So, for example, recently, one of the trade associations that we deal with had put some pressure on. And I think it was about, because in some areas, there are some businesses that are exempt from the charges for the clean air zone. Now, the best example of that is a home to school transport. And in some of the areas, they were saying, well, no, you need to tell us that you're exempt and then we'll apply it, and not do it automatically, which obviously leads to fines being given, because then there's time that when they're applying that it's not being applied. So they managed to get them to agree that it was just applied automatically. So if you are in one of these areas, there's not a lot you can do about it now. It's live. These things go to consultation. If you're sat in an area where you've heard of whisperings that they might be looking to implement a clean air zone where you are, then keep an eye out for the consultation, because there has to be a public consultation on it, and that gives you the opportunity to give your views on it and how it should look. If a clean air zone is then implemented in your area and you think that the way they've done it is wrong, there are ways to challenge it, for example, a judicial review, but you have to be involved at the start and tell them why what they're doing doesn't make sense and why they should be doing it in a different way. If it's already live in your area and you think that there's ways it's being run that is incorrect, then you need to speak up and say something. But in terms of clean air zones, I think it's come straight from government, because from the government being judicially reviewed. So the local authorities have got to do it. And I don't think there's much ground to be saying that it shouldn't be done per se. But I think you need to, and it's important for operators in affected areas to realise that you should speak up. You should respond to consultations. And if there is one in your area and you don't think it's being done correctly and there's a better way, then speak up and shape it, because this is all new. I mean, our first one was 2020. We've had 2021. We've of course had COVID, which I guess removed a few years from our lives, really, and in terms of looking how it's going to be long term. So it's all relatively new. So I would definitely urge anybody or any business that has something to say about it to speak up, because that's the only way you're going to get it to a point where it's run in a commercial way.
How about if usually it happens that companies operate in more than just one city, and then each city has their own restrictions, but also you mentioned their own funding processes. What happens if you operate, let's say, in Manchester and then also in Birmingham, do you have to apply for both differently?
Therein the $1 million question, because at the moment, the majority of them, your depot or your business has to be within a certain mile of the clean air zone for you to be applicable for that area. Now, obviously, we've got the argument to say, well, I'm not in that area, but I still drive through it 10 times a week. Again, what we're saying here is, well, apply, because ultimately, if you can evidence, if you can evidence you go through 10 times a week, my view is if you don't apply, then you're definitely not getting it. Whereas if you apply and you don't get it, then at least you've tried. Secondly, a lot of these areas are having discretionary funding as well. So once they all get a pot, don't they, of money. So some areas, all that money's not gone. So they move on to the discretionary funding. And the discretionary funding is, as the title says, it's discretionary. So whilst you might not meet the criteria for the funding that's available, if that's then exhausted and there's still some money left as discretionary, my view is if you can show that whilst you not operate in the area, you drive through it so many times, you would have a good chance of getting the funding. Also, again, if it's refused and you think that it's irrational or you shouldn't have been refused it because you're going through it, again, that gives grounding to legal challenge. But you need to be asking the questions in order to be in the game, to be saying that what they're doing is wrong. So my view is, if you're sat there thinking, well, I don't operate in, Birmingham, but I'm not located there, but I'm driving through there so many times, it's going to cost me so much money, apply, look to exhaust your options with the discretionary funding. And if you think it's wrong that you've been refused, then you can get legal advice on it and you can look at whether you should be getting it.
Well, Libby, thank you very much for your time.
No, thank you.
For everyone watching, you will be able, if you're registered and we have your email details, you will be able to get more information from Libby, from Backhouse, as well as from all of our speakers later after we finish the event.